All right, so let me talk a little bit about me. I mean, my background is in religious freedom. I have been working in the area of, non-discrimination largely since I was in law school. And when I was first in private practice, I did labor law, which is where which is really where people, you have freedom issues in the workplace, freedom to be a woman, freedom to be a Muslim, freedom to be a Catholic, and so as I learned, kind of how do you manage, structures of discrimination? How do you manage kind of these cultural barriers that the people on the receiving end experience as discrimination? Okay, so there's both the receiving end part, which is basically what many of you have been studying, and then there is what I would call that cultural part, which is the people who are acting badly. Okay, and so what I'd like to talk about is a theme that I have been working on now for probably about a year. And it fits, and I'll tell you exactly how it fits in to the work that Professor Al-Hibri and I have been doing for quite some time. And I was honored, I don't remember how many years ago it's been since Professor Al-Hibri and I have been working together and have been friends, but one of the things that we determined, basically after 9/11, is that we knew that there were going to be issues. There were going to be big issues. And that there were obviously the problem with structures of discrimination is that the people who practice it are usually clueless about the fact that it's happening. Okay, and I'll give you an example. Very, very simple one. One of my very first cases as a labor lawyer involved a public school district in Ohio where there were two kinds of janitors. There were janitor ones and janitor twos. The janitor ones were all men, and the janitor twos were all women. Okay, now, as any good lawyer does, you go and explore what the facts are. How does it work? Well, we found out that the reason that the janitor ones got more money than the janitor twos is because they were more experienced. Right? And so what they would do, as we explored, we began to find out that the janitor ones would stand there and supervise while the women did all the work. Okay, now, we've all seen that. Okay, we've all seen that. And the difficult part was not in kind of laying out the case. Any decent lawyer knows how to lay out a case and explain what's wrong. The difficult part was explaining to the school authorities why that wasn't right. Okay, now I want you to think about that for a minute. The school wanted to do the right thing, and they were absolutely baffled by the fact that these really nice women would sue them. And after a while, you kind of said, how many times do you need to tell these people no before they're going to pick up something and hit you with it, which is what a lawsuit is. Okay, now, it's that cultural piece that I want you to think about now, okay, because in the last, I'd say 12, 15 years now, we've been working, back in 2003, we at Catholic U decided that somebody had to reach out to the Iranians. Okay, and we have a very close colleague, Ayatollah Ahmad Iravani, who opened up the doors, for us to speak with the Iranians. And the question was, how do you speak to the Iranians, right? And the answer was, you take them as you find them. Okay, you take them as you find them. Now that is a theme that is going to run through all of my remarks this morning. It's like, we can complain about the way things are as much as we want, but we're stuck with that. So the question becomes, do you focus on the victim of the discrimination, or do you try to change the mind of the person who has made them a victim? Okay, and the second part is a lot harder. It takes a lot longer, right? And so, what we learned is we said, well, look, if you're going to speak with the Iranian leadership, you have to speak their language, right? And now all of you are here because you have experience and you have knowledge about Islamic law. You want to learn more, that's why you're here. And you want to learn how to integrate it into what you're doing, right? And there's a wonderful scriptural passage in the Christian scriptures in the New Testament, where it's an account of when God comes and inspires the apostles. And it said, and they went out and they spoke. And it said, and all the audience was amazed because they heard them in their own language. Okay, now what that means, now my grandmother was a Pentecostal Christian. She believed that you could speak in tongues, right? And as a kid, I found that rather difficult. I said, but Grandma, how is it that the people out there could understand, right? I said, isn't it true? Go ahead.
What is speaking in tongues?
Okay, it is, speaking, it's hard to explain, but it's basically people speak as the Spirit moves them. So to many people, it would seem like babbling, right? So, I can't explain it, I don't do it, but the whole point being, it's like a religious ritual, right? And so to most people, it's not going to make any sense at all. But if it's going to be understood, it's because God has made it possible for the hearer to understand, right? And so when you look at one of the inspirational Christian leaders, St. Francis, in the prayer of St. Francis, you hear, not that I be understood, not that I understand, but that I seek to be understood, right? And so if the focus remains on the other, right, the question then begins to be, how do you use the talents that God gave you to influence those in authority to pay attention to the other? Okay, now as I looked through all of your bios, I thought, wow, what an interesting group of women. I mean, you're from all over the place. Every single society in which you operate has exactly the same kinds of structures, that we have here. Human beings basically were made by one creator. And so there's not much variation in terms of the design, and so therefore there's not much variation in terms of the problems. They just manifest themselves in slightly different ways. And so when I look at the curriculum that you have in terms of how do I use Islamic law, how do I use Islam as a means to be understood? Okay, now one of the things that we learned in our workings with the Iranians, now some very, very senior people, we've been at it now for about 12 years, and when we moved into the international sphere, the almost invariably the response among the practitioners of realpolitik said, this is craziness. Why would you put religion at the center of a discussion of important things, right? And you can see if you unpack that statement, that religion is not an important thing. It's an important thing only insofar as it causes problems, right? But we know you wouldn't be here unless you didn't think that religion was an important thing, okay? And the question then becomes, what gifts did God give you that brought you here? You know, and that will allow you, because I also notice how many of you have fluency in several languages, right? You know, many of you speak multiple languages. If not well, then pretty well, okay? And you know better than most that translation is an art, right? You do not translate words, you translate concepts. And sometimes describing an idea is a bit like painting a picture. You know, it's not easy. It doesn't, things don't translate immediately. And so what we found is that one of the most important things in this dialogue that we've now had for 12 years with the Iranian leadership is that the very first thing to do was to get them to talk about how Islam motivates what they do. And it's in the listening. Why do you do the things you do? Not in an accusatory way, but in a, well, let's talk about, and then you'd pick a topic. Now, we have spoken with them about family law. We've spoken to them about possession and use of weapons of mass destruction. We've talked to them about ethics, business ethics. We've talked to them about economic and social development. And every conversation was exactly the same. Let's start with the Islamic point of view. Let's move to the Jewish point of view. And then let's look at how Christians look at this. And once everybody got their ideas out on the table, you then saw what the concepts were. Yeah, and once you could get a handle on the concepts, then you could have a pretty decent discussion. And now I'm going to go back to the example I gave you about the janitor ones and the janitor twos. I mean, we knew from talking to the people who actually managed the schools that they wanted to do the right thing, right? They wanted to do the right thing. They didn't see themselves as being sex discriminators. They thought that everything was based on experience, right? And so what you had to do is adjust their understanding of what the facts are, right? Now, sometimes that's easy. In that case, it was easy. Once they saw it, they said, okay, we'll settle the case, and there'll be no more janitor ones and twos. You know, and then the next one would be, so when are you going to promote some of the women? Okay, but, you know, life proceeds in small steps. And so as you kind of are immersed in the excellent curriculum that KARAMAH has put together for you for this program, you know, what you want to do is you want to talk to as many people as possible about what it is they're doing. You know, how have they succeeded? You know, what did you do to get that job at the White House? You know, that you can learn a lot from. You know, and what were the biggest mistakes that you made? If you had certain things to do over, what would you not do? All right? And so what we see in the area of religion in foreign affairs, you know, which is what I do a lot of now, is how is it that we get people who operate these structures, whether or not they're the State Department or the White House or the National Security Council or the Iranian government, how do we get people to actually stop and look at the way things really are? Right? Now, you know the way things are in the societies from which you come. Right? And sometimes you need people from the outside to help you figure out what to do. But more important, what I find more important is to find people of good faith on the inside who will speak to you in private about what their misgivings are. Okay, let me give you now a very current example. As you know, here in the United States, one of the big issues is, do we ratify this agreement that the president made with Iran? Okay, and the Israeli government is going, is not happy, right? They're not happy. The hardliners in Iran are not happy. The hardliners here are not happy. Okay, and you say, well, what is it exactly that you're not happy about? Okay, and what you will find is that almost invariably they're looking at the situation through the wrong end of binoculars. If you take binoculars, you get to see the wide range of things, but if you turn them around and look at it the other way, you just see like a little dot. And you know better than most that the world is much bigger than Iran and the United States and Iran and Israel. What we have now is a group of extremists who are redrawing the map of the entire Middle East. Now, don't mistake my statement of saying that to thinking that I thought that was a good map in the first place. That was drawn after World War I and World War II by people who didn't live there. All right, but the question, and this is the same thing that has happened, I know that one of you is from Kosovo. The same thing happened in the former Yugoslavia. Other people drew the maps. Okay, and so the question then becomes, what do people like you do with all the knowledge that you bring to the table, with all the knowledge that you're going to be learning here? And one of the things that I've learned over time is that the most important thing you can do is listen. But to get other people to help you to figure out who you're supposed to be listening to. Okay, so the listening is a skill that God gave you. You have to develop it, obviously. But at the same time, you have to reach out and start listening to people who nobody else will listen to. Okay, now that's, and so when we said back in 2002, why don't we go listen to the Iranians? People thought we were absolutely crazy. Why would you talk to them? Right? And the reaction on the Iranian side was exactly the same. Why would you talk to representatives of the great Satan? Why would you do that? What good could possibly come out of that? And the answer is, everybody needs friends. So that when the two governments eventually come to some kind of rapprochement, there will be people on both sides who know each other, who trust each other, who've worked together, who've tried to solve problems together. And what I'm suggesting to you is that you are those people going forward. You have to see yourselves as, in effect, you know how when a lock is stuck, you take some graphite and you squirt it into the lock and you work it around and eventually you're that. You're the graphite in the lock. Why? Because you have been in both. You've been here, you're there, you're going to have a network of friends that most people would kill for, and you've got to use it. Right? And so God's given you these gifts, and one of them is Islam itself. Okay, and that's the part where here in Washington, it's still very, very difficult to get people to understand that religion is an important part of international affairs. Very, very difficult. Why? Because they see the problems that extremists of every camp create. But the fact of the matter is that religion is part of everyday life. It's a part of how I grew up. You know, there's a famous saying here in the United States that you can take the boy out of Iowa, but you can't take Iowa out of the boy, right? And that's true. I mean, I grew up as a Catholic kid with Italian grandparents, okay? That's me. You know, and so I've got to learn how to fit that into, you know, and we had religious wars in my family, right? You know, people wouldn't talk to each other because of where they went to church. And I thought, as one of the middle children, I was one of the middle out of 26 first cousins, you know, that this was really stupid. I mean, these are family members, right? Well, I mean, looked at kind of globally, we're all part of God's family. You know, of course there are real issues. You know them in your societies better than anybody else does. You know who you have to reach out to. But don't let anybody talk you out of bringing that religious tradition to the front, because that's the language that the people in your society speak. So if you come in there speaking Western human rights, they're not only not gonna understand you, they're not gonna listen to you. You've got to speak to them in the language that they will understand, and you're the translator. Okay, and so and I can tell you now that trying to talk with people about how do you deal with extremism in the Middle East, Daesh, how do you deal with that? You know, I will guarantee you that if I were to call together a group of very, very high-powered military and economic, they would push the religious side off to the side and say, we can't deal with that. And my reaction is to the contrary. You have to put that at the center of your discussion, because as many ancient proverbs say, from Sun Tzu to, you know, some very, very significant Middle Eastern poets, that you have to know who you're speaking to, right? You have to know how they think. And the asset that you all bring to the table is that you already know how the people that you live with think. You know, and the challenge is going to be to go back and to learn more about those people. And what I'm suggesting to you, just as I had to learn as a young attorney, the people you really need to talk to are the people who are causing the problems, right? Because if you can get them to change, and more importantly, not beat them into change, but to show them the right way to change. Because as I understand, and you can correct me, you know, but Sharia means the way, right? It's the right path. In the New Testament, Jesus says, I am the way, follow me. Right? In Proverbs, in the Hebrew scriptures, it says, show them the right path. Right? Who's at the end of that path? The end of that path is the God who made us. Right? It's very, very difficult to stay on that path. It's very, very difficult to explain to people what the right path is. But you're the translators. Right? You know, you are accomplished women. That's a gift that God gave you. The question is, how do you use it in a way to kind of change the things around you? And so what we're finding here in our experience with with, I'd say 12 years of now working with the Iranians and now kind of branching out and working with Iraqis and others, people in Afghanistan. What we're realizing is that when you bring that faith perspective to the table, there does come a point at which people listen to you. You know, and it's not listening to me. What I say is, let me introduce you to people like Professor Al-Hibri, who actually knows what she's talking about. You know, and one of the things you'll learn about being a, quote, expert is that experts always know who to call when they don't know the right answer, right? And that experts know when to say they don't know. Because if you give the wrong answer, you'll never be an expert again. Okay, but if you say, I don't know, I'll get back to you, then people will be waiting for your phone call. You know, so with that, I don't think I'm going to say much more. You know, I just want to open up the floor for questions and see what you have to say. So thank you very much. Well, there were multiple issues like that. Okay, and let me just start with the keeping the conversation going problem. Okay, because first of all, if you study the history of Iranian American relations, you know, you find that for the first 150 years, the United States had very few relationships with Iran at all. We were a small country. We were here in North America. There wasn't much trade, you know, and it was really kind of after World War II that those relationships got started. And if we had done what President Eisenhower back in 1953 had suggested, the relationships would have been just fine. But instead, we took the side of the British, who were trying to continue stealing some of the oil, and things went downhill from there. Okay, now, as you well know, if you want to have good relationships with a neighbor, don't steal their car, right? Or don't steal the oil out of their car, right? Okay, so this relationship is, at least since 1979, has been characterized by one of profound mistrust. Okay, so our goal was really quite simple, is to kind of identify people who could work together and who could trust each other. Okay, now I have to tell you, a really good lawyer does not sit in her office trying to figure out how to do good things. She's out there talking to all the people that she can talk to find out what's going on. You know, and if you know that there's a particularly bad actor in some ministry, you should be out there having coffee with them, right? Because you will find eventually that he kind of wants to do the right, most people kind of want to do the right thing, right? You know, but they don't know how to. And that's why God sent you. You are his gift to the bad guys. You know, and you have to see yourself that way. So what did we do? We have a very small core group of people that works together. And what we would do is, you know, at first the meetings were very tense. You know, they would give their kind of, you know, great Satan speeches. And you know, we would try not to be defensive. And you know, we had a group of European friends who were watching all this thinking this is never going to go anywhere. And it took a couple of years, actually, before people actually said, after the formal meetings, like, could we get together after dinner and really talk? That took probably 3 years. You know, and what we would find out, and remember, during all this time was President Khatami, then the election of President Ahmadinejad, you know, and as the relationships between the two countries got more and more tense, we would, rather than try and push, we would retreat further back into academic and religious discussions. So that every time, where most human rights people will go, as we would say, to the left, to the more progressive side, we would do exactly the opposite and go to the more religious side. Why? Because those are the people we wanted to get to be friends with. You know, and we wanted them to trust us. Okay, so the whole question of what is success? You have to have definitions of like what's success. One of them is to make sure you don't get thrown out of the guy's office. So that you can regularly have coffee and discuss what's going on. Because he needs to see you as a resource. You know, if you can get men in power in the societies in which you live to see that women are independent women, are a resource that God has given the community, but they're not men's playthings. I mean, if you could get that idea across to one person in your career, it would be a success. But when we said, what about really difficult issues? We've dealt with some really difficult issues. We've dealt with prisoners, but you wanted to see a discussion with blood on the floor was a discussion of the Palestinians. You know, the Palestine-Israeli conflict. But in the end, what we found after that really heavy-duty discussion, where you had people who had lived in Israel in the discussion, you know, and what you found is that the Palestinian people themselves were almost irrelevant to the conversation. It's like, you know, wouldn't we be better off if we thought about, as I asked some Iranian friends a number of years ago, I said, look, I understand that you're in favor of the Palestinians. So, where's the swimming pools? Where's the housing? Where's the businesses? Where's the trade? If you really care about these people, how come they're not on the top of every social program list that you have? You know, and they look at you and they say, I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah, so these are the kinds of questions you need to be able to ask people. Yes, always. Everything we've done has been, as we would say, Abrahamic. Okay, so we start with the idea that the Muslim, Jewish, and Christian traditions all trace their lineage back to Abraham's encounter, right? And so the idea is that, look, we live together in a world that's growing smaller and smaller. So if I need to understand how am I going to reach Muslim communities with my message, the first Muslim community I have to meet is my Muslim colleague.
Who would pick those Muslims? I mean, I'm trying to get to where was your definition, other than Dr. Al-Hibri, if she was approached, where did you get your Muslim information to get the Islam information?
We always, from the beginning, on the Iranian side, we always had Iranian senior scholars involved. You know, so I mean, I can't even think of a time when we weren't getting Muslim input. You know, basically you pick, you know, if you're Muslim and you say, well, look, I need to get some Christians involved, you're going to pick a Christian friend that you trust and say, I want you to scope out, look around, and like, here's the discussion we want to have. Who do you think should be involved in it? You know, and ideally you'll usually have about 2 or 3 people that you can call, that you trust. And they'll say, well, you know, I wouldn't pick him. You know, Professor Al-Hibri and I were talking about that this morning. He says, well, you got to be careful who you talk to. You know, and so that's why you need to have ongoing working relationships with these other communities. You know, and look, if you were to go see the bad guy at the school board, right? You'd say, well, look, let's look and see how you can save money by utilizing your women better. right? I mean, so there's a lot of different ways in which you can do this, but you always have to get the relevant, you have to bring, you know, if you're thinking politically, and I think politically a lot, and being a middle child, I always think in terms of coalitions, you know, that you think, who do I need to have at the table with me? Because politics is the art of inclusion, not the art of exclusion. Well, interestingly enough, the first formal meeting we had was in 2004, and we actually had both Iranian and Israeli women at the meeting. It was about Abrahamic perspectives on marriage and family law. And so what we did is we picked a topic where you'd have to be insane not to have women. You know, and what the Iranians did, Ayatollah Damad in particular, he picked some of the most sophisticated women that he knew. So one of them was the women's rights advisor to President Khatami. You know, one was a senior Islamic woman philosopher from the University of Tehran. You know, there were like 4 really senior women. We had a senior Egyptian woman come from the Sunni side, and we had several, you know, American and Israeli, you know, Jewish women come. I mean, it's basically you say women have to be at the table from the very beginning. You just say, look, that's a rule. Now there were times when we couldn't do it just because they weren't experts in the field, you know, but we always, almost invariably, we had women from the very beginning. You know, what we did is we did something that is called, the way we would describe it is we hid in the open. Okay, basically what we did is we told everybody what we were doing. You know, and so for the very first, and I'll tell you how it actually happened. My daughter, who is now 28, you know, had a very good friend whose mother worked at the State Department. And she happened to be an assistant secretary for South Asia. And so I called her up and I said, you know, I mean, I would see her at the swimming pool with the kids. And I said, I have something business-wise to talk to you about. And so I told her all about what we were going to do. And she said, here's who you talk to. So we went over to the State Department, sat down with them and said, here's what we plan to do. And they said, oh, that's really interesting. When it's done, come back over and tell us what happened. You know? And because officially they weren't allowed to say anything. You know, but what we began to see over time is they were getting jealous. They said, how come you guys get to talk to these people? And it's our job to talk to them and we're not allowed to talk to them. But then about, I'd say 6 years into the process, the gentleman who is now President Rouhani's chief of staff, Mohammad Nahavandian, who at the time was the president of the Iranian Chamber of Commerce, suggested that we might bring business leaders together to talk about corruption and business. Okay, because if there's one thing that's true about sanctions, is that they breed corruption. Okay, and so we decided that we're going to have a business ethics conference. And at that minute, I thought, I don't think I would look good in a prison outfit. So I thought what I should do is go down and ask the people at the State Department, here's what we're going to do. How would you suggest that we proceed? You know, and interestingly enough, again, we didn't go in with the idea that we needed permission. Because if you ask a bureaucrat for permission, they will say no, because it's just easier. So we've always proceeded on the grounds of it's better to ask forgiveness than permission, right? And nothing is more disarming to a bureaucrat as please help me understand. right? And so they walked us through the process of getting a license. Okay, and so we said, we're going to get business people from Iran and the United States, and we're going to bring them together, but we will make sure that none of the business people have anything to do with the arms industry. So we brought, you know, a banker who specializes in farm commodities, you know, a person who builds houses, a person who imports fabric. I mean, basically anything that is like completely, you see what the government's concern is, you stay 180 degrees away from it. You know, and it took 2 years to get it done, but we were doing the process of the meetings while we were applying for the license, and they knew it. So, you know, the whole point, and I learned this many years ago from the former president of Catholic University. He said, if you're working in a university environment and you want to change things, make sure that you always tell people in writing what you're going to do at least 8 months before, and then keep reminding them that that's what you're going to do. And then when they finally wake up and see that you do it, you're going to have 8 months of memos in the file that said, we told you what we were going to do, because the first thing they will say, we didn't know you were going to do that, right? You have to have that paper trail. And that's what we've done with the Iranians, and it's worked so far. You know, because in the end, people need information. On the Iranian side, we've been a conduit for information, a conduit that has worked both ways. And they've learned a lot from us, and we've learned a lot from them. You know, and it's been worth it in that regard. So in that regard, we've tried to be the graphite in the lock, right? And what we were told last week is that now that the negotiations are over, our role becomes more important because there's no more official conversations going on. You know, so my reaction is, okay, so what's next? Okay, and that's the challenge you're all going to have when you go back. You know what's next. I mean, you know, you have your little list of things to do, you know, but just make sure that you don't do it alone, and just make sure that everybody knows you're doing it while you're doing it. Okay, because as soon as somebody starts to saying, are you sure you really want to do that? Then you need to listen to that. Because people who like you will try and keep you out of trouble. Right? Even people that don't agree with you. If they like you, if they have coffee with you, they will work to keep you out of trouble, but you got to listen to them. Okay, and that's what we've tried to do here. So that's how we've kind of stayed out of trouble. Any other questions? Yes?
You might have answered this in a way, but how do you define the work that you do to people who are skeptical of your intentions?
How do we describe the work that we do to people who are skeptical of our intentions?
Defend.
I think, well, we don't really defend it. What we do is we just explain it. Okay, and I had that experience just the other day, showing a paper that I had written to a friend who completely disagrees with even talking to the Iranians. And you know, his comment was, wow, this is really pretty interesting. I still don't like them, you know, but it's pretty interesting. So what you need to be able to do is give people enough information that they can use. Okay, and the thing is, you don't need to explain the whole thing of what you're doing. You just need to it's like, you know, one of the things you learn as a parent is, what do you do the first time your child asks about sex? I mean, most parents kind of fall into into jello, right? What am I supposed to say? Usually it's one question. You know, and there's not going to be a follow-up question. The next question is going to be, where's the peanut butter? You know, because kids have short attention spans. Well, so do most politicians. You know? So do most politicians. And so I can tell you from experience, having gone in to see a very, very conservative, very outspoken senator, where we described everything we were doing. And he said, "You really know all those people?" I said, "Yeah, we do." He said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "How'd you like to come?" He said, "I can't come." He says, "But can I send one of my staff members?" I said, "Not yet." He says, "You first, staff members later." But what we have is like a preliminary commitment from one of the most conservative members of the US Senate to maybe come and sit in on the discussion. Okay, and if you're on TV, I would be more than happy if he beat me up on TV, as long as I know that in the background I've got this agreement. So you can't be afraid of people yelling at you. You're not going to be, whether you're a women's rights advocate here in the United States or in wherever you're from, you can't be shy. But you do need to be sophisticated, and you do need to understand who you're talking to. So, give them as much information as they need and no more. The tendency of we academics is to give them like a book, and what they really need is the summary, the 2-page summary. That's a really tough question, because we all have them. And what is really, I think, what is really the case, I think, in most instances, there are some people who are just really bad people, right? And the problem with most really bad people is they don't really think they're really bad people. And I have always found, I was told this a number of years ago, and it was really one of the more profound insights into human nature that I've ever been exposed to. And it was basically, if somebody who is completely on the other side of you, the first thing you need to know is your disagreement one of principle or not? Because if it is, you can work around that. But if the other person is completely driven by self-interest, right, there's no way you can work around that. Okay, so basically, if the other person is all about himself or herself 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you basically are going to need to treat them like a wall on a freeway. You just have to stay away from it, right? But if somebody kind of disagrees with you as a matter of principle, that disagreement becomes something that will help shape your relationship. And it's hard. It's really hard. I was involved in a case back in the late 1970s, where the attorney from the other side came and she says, "There's no reason for me to talk to you." She says, "We just completely disagree," and and my reaction was like, "It's nice to meet you." Right? That was what she said, when I put my hand out to shake her hand. And it's like, in the end, one of the biggest mistakes I made with her was not to go have coffee one day. Just to kind of leave that go. And look, life is short, and time is limited. So you have to be strategic on who and how you deal with people who disagree with you. But in the end, our experience with the Iranian side has always been to let them be our guides, and to tell us, how far can we go, and sometimes it's been 1 step forward and 2 steps back, sometimes it's been 3 steps back, but the whole point was, do we continue walking together or not, and we've succeeded so far. I think the easiest way to answer that is to say that you can't do any of this by yourself. That you always need 2 or 3 people that you're working with who if one of you is all heart, you need another one of you who's all head, and then you need somebody else who's kind of in the middle. Because, as they always say about how a rope is made of at least 3 strands, right? And together, the 3 strands, keep it strong. And so you can't do this by yourself. And so, it's like, look, if you want to go, there are times when you really just want to go rip somebody's throat out, right? But you can't do that because that'll be the last discussion that you have. So you may want to figure out who is the better person to go do that. It might not always be you. And so the whole idea being that it doesn't matter who takes the flag to the top of the hill. It matters that it gets there. So there are many times, there are times, of course, that you want to bear witness, but you're going to have to do that in a way that makes sense. And one of the things that and my wife reminds me of this all the time. She says, there are just certain battles you leave to somebody else. And so sometimes you can give those impassioned speeches, but you got to think strategically about them, and that's the piece that a group that gets together like this, and you'll all have each other's emails and your phone numbers. You need to continue thinking together. The most important function of this group, of this time, is to create a network of people that you can say, look, I got this problem, what do I do? And there are going to be people who are going to call you and say, I've got this problem. Who can you put me in touch with that can help me figure out what it is? So, and I see this, I saw this in my family. I knew, for example, that I could be really passionate about things with my mother, but I might as well have talked to that lamp. It was just, she wouldn't react that way. So you have to think about how are you going to be heard. So with my mother, even though I would get angry, I would leave stuff around the house for her to read. One time she said, I know exactly what you're doing. I said, good. Let me know what you think after you read it. So it's, you learn in your family how to deal with all of this. And really, it's not much different as you get out there. It's people are people. Forgive me if I sounded a little too global, but there are going to be people that you just can't deal with, right? And then the question becomes, you can't avoid them, so then what? And the answer is, who do I work with? How do I get can I get somebody else to carry the water for me? Because remember, those insights you have about this person are going to be very valuable, but you may not be the person to carry the message. Okay, so when I say to avoid them, it may mean personally avoiding them, but it may not mean avoiding the issue, right? Because in the end, a person who is self-interested, at least if you can figure out what their self-interest is, then they're easy, right? Because then you show them why it's in their interest. But you may not be the person to do it. And the problem with somebody who's completely motivated by self-interest is that they're completely unpredictable because you don't know how they view their own self-interest. So you need to kind of work with people who've worked with them in other situations, and kind of you form a circle and you kind of try and maneuver them into the place where you need them to be. But sometimes that's just, it's just difficult. And if you have a really negative personal relationship with them, then you're going to have to get somebody else to help you. That's why you need kind of a team approach to these things. And especially, that's especially true in institutions. And I have seen some of the worst. I noticed in several of your bios, you want to start your own nonprofits. Some of the worst, ugliest interpersonal battles I've seen is in committed people, among people who have committed nonprofits, because they all see themselves as doing good, right? And I think that's a really important thing. But then they fight over how to do good. And this is where you need, I hate to put it this way, but I give my wife credit for this. She's a social worker, and she says, occasionally you need some adult discipline, right? Where you're the adult version of sending a child to stand in the corner. You need somebody who can come in and reach this person. And sometimes it's really hard to do, but you can't do it by yourself. That's the point. Well, let me start with now, and then I'll look backwards. In the end, the Iranians that I know now are no different than the ones then. What I thought of them as being just really, really interesting people. I mean, that I had no way of imagining what their life was like. So I basically stopped trying. And so there's no way I could, even today, that if I were to go and live in Iran for a year, I would make all the same mistakes that any other foreigner would make. But at least I would know that I would have people I could call and say, I think I insulted somebody, what did I do? So in one respect, I kind of see the same people. What I've seen is that, when you reach the point where they introduce you to their children, or you get invited over to their house. As one of my good friends who's a member of Congress told me, he was involved in the first big negotiations between the United States and Russia over nuclear weapons. And he said, he says it was really the dinners. He says, when we got to the point where we started taking out pictures of our kids, that I could ask how his uncle who had cancer was doing, he says, then I knew we would get an agreement. He says it was nothing more sophisticated than that. It's hard to, we get really, you go into college and you study international politics and you study Islamic law, but in the end, when the Iranians, one of the great revelations that our Iranian friends have shared with us, they said, look, we need your help, they said, in training Sharia judges. Because really, they don't get much training. So they don't really know what due process means. And one of them, a very, very conservative guy, he says, you should have put those Guantanamo trials on television. He says, because then we would have seen how your justice system works. And you could have had somebody who spoke Farsi explaining, here's what the judge is doing, here's what the questions are about, and here's why they're doing it. He says, because even if we disagree on what you're doing, we are really interested in knowing how you're doing it, because it's so different than what we do. Okay, and what Professor Al-Hibri and I have been talking about is, what do we do about these maniacs called Daesh? What do we do about them? And more importantly, if you were going to try some of the big ringleaders, the people who buy and sell the oil that supports them, the commanders that order that whole communities of Christians and Yazidis and Druze be killed, how do you work together, Muslim, Christian, Jew, and other? How do you work together to talk about justice? These are discussions that need to be had now, because it's going to take a few years to get something like that together. So, these are the kinds of questions that that, you know, what I think now, what I thought then is that these are really interesting people. What I think now is these are people like me that I can work with. And, you know, and then you figure out the rest as you work it out.